The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler, May 13th, St. Robert Bellarmine, S.J. One of the greatest controversialists of all times and the most distinguished defender of the Church against the Protestant Reformation was Robert Francis Romula Bellarmine, whose feast is celebrated on this day. Roberto was born in 1542 in the town of Montepulciano in Tuscany. He was a member of a noble family in decline. His parents were Vincent Bellarmine and Cinzia Cervi, sister of Pope Marcellus II. As a child, Robert showed signs of superior intelligence. He knew Virgil by heart, wrote good Latin verses, played the violin, and thus soon began to play a brilliant role in public disputes to the great admiration of his fellow citizens. His devotion did not yield to his intelligence. When he was 17 years old, the rector of the Jesuit College of Montepulciano wrote about him in a letter, "He is the best of our students and is not far from the kingdom of heaven." Robert wanted to enter the Society of Jesus, but his father, who had other plans for him, was strongly opposed. However, with the help of his mother, the young man finally obtained the desired permission. In 1560, Robert presented himself in Rome before the general of the Jesuits, who greatly reduced the time of his novitiate and assigned him almost immediately to continue his studies at the Roman college. Robert had to struggle all his life against ill health. At the end of the 3 years of philosophy, he was so weak that the superiors sent him to take his native airs. The young religious took advantage of his stay in Tuscany to instruct the children and to give lectures on Latin rhetoric and poetics. A year later, he was transferred to Mondovi in Piedmont and assigned to give courses on Cicero and Demosthenes. Robert knew of Greek only the alphabet, but with his characteristic obedience and energy, he prepared in the evening the Greek grammar lesson he was to give the next day. The future cardinal was opposed to corporal punishment of students and never used it. His provincial, Father Adorno, who heard him preach one day, immediately sent him to the University of Padua so that he could receive priestly ordination as soon as possible. Roberto gave himself again to preaching and study, but soon after, the Father General, St. Francis Borgia, sent him to Louvain to continue his studies and to preach at the university, to counteract the dangerous doctrines that the Chancellor Miguel Bayo and others were spreading. In the trip to Belgium, he had as companion the Englishman William Allen, who would also be, one day, Cardinal. Bellarmine spent 7 years in Louvain. His sermons were extraordinarily popular from the first day, even though he preached in Latin and was of such short stature that he would climb on a stool to stand out in the pulpit so that the audience could see and hear him. But his listeners said that his face shone in an extraordinary way and that his words were inspired. After his ordination to the priesthood in Ghent in 1570, he held a chair at the University of Louvain. He was the first Jesuit to be conferred this honor. His courses on the Summa of St. Thomas, in which he brilliantly expounded the doctrine of the Holy Doctor, gave him the opportunity to refute the doctrines of Bayo on grace, freedom, and pontifical authority. But he never yielded to the brutality of the controversies of the time, for he neither attacked his adversaries personally nor mentioned their names. Notwithstanding the overwhelming work he had with his sermons and classes, St. Robert still found time at Louvain to learn Hebrew alone and to study in depth the Holy Scriptures and the writings of the Holy Fathers. The Hebrew grammar he wrote then for the help of students became very popular. As his health began to fail, his superiors called him back to Italy. St. Charles Borromeo tried to have him assigned to Milan, but he was appointed to the new chair of apologetic theology at the Roman College. For 9 years, beginning in 1576, he worked tirelessly on that chair and on the preparation of the 4 huge volumes of his discussions on controversial points. 3 centuries later, the competent historian Hefele called this work the most complete defense of Catholicism that has been published up to the present day. St. Robert was so thoroughly acquainted with the Bible, the Holy Fathers, and the writings of the heretics that many of his opponents could not believe that his controversies were the work of a single writer, and maintained that his name was the anagram of a collection of wise and hypocritical Jesuits. St. Robert's controversies appeared at the most opportune moment, for the leading reformers had just published a series of volumes in which they proposed to prove that, from the historical point of view, Protestantism was the true representative of the Church of the Apostles. As these volumes had been published in Magdeburg, and each volume corresponded to a century, the collection received the name of the Centuries or the Magdeburg Centuries. Baronius refuted this work from the historical point of view, and Bellarmine from the dogmatic point of view. The success of the Controversies was instantaneous. Clerics and laymen, Catholics and Protestants read the volumes avidly. In London, where the work was banned, a bookseller declared, "This Jesuit has made me more money than all the other theologians put together." In 1589, Saint Robert had to interrupt his studies for some time to accompany Cardinal Cajetan on a diplomatic embassy to France, then torn by the war between Henry of Navarre and the League. The embassy did not produce any results, but its members lived the experience of 8 months of siege in Paris, where, according to Saint Robert Bellarmine, they did nothing but suffered much. Contrary to Cardinal Cajetan, who favored the Spaniards, Saint Robert openly supported the idea of making a pact with Henry of Navarre, provided he converted to Catholicism. But Pope Sixtus V died at that time, shortly after the end of the siege, and the ambassadors were called back to Rome. Somewhat later, St. Robert headed a commission which Pope Clement VIII had charged with preparing the publication of a revised edition of the Vulgate, according to the instructions of the Council of Trent. Already in the time of Sixtus VI, an edition had been prepared, under the supervision of the pontiff, but the lack of knowledge of the exegetes and the fear of modifying too much the current text had turned it into a useless work of very reduced circulation. The new version, which received the imprimatur of Clement VIII, preceded by a preface by St. Robert Bellarmine, is the Latin text in use today. St. Robert was then living at the Roman College. As spiritual director of the house, he had been in close contact with St. Aloysius Gonzaga, whom he attended on his deathbed. The future cardinal was so fond of the young saint that he asked to be buried at his feet, for he was at one time my spiritual son. It was then that the career of honors began for St. Robert. In 1592, he was appointed rector of the Roman College, and in 1594, provincial of Naples. 3 years later, he returned to Rome to work as theologian to Clement VIII. At the express wish of the pontiff, he wrote his 2 famous catechisms, one of which is still used in Italy. It is said that these catechisms have been the most translated books after the Bible and the Imitation of Christ. In 1598, quite against his will, Bellarmine was elevated to the cardinalate by Clement VIII in reward for his unequaled learning. Although this obliged him to live in the Vatican and to have a certain number of servants, the saint did not abandon his customary austerity and limited his servitude and household expenses to the bare essentials. He fed, like the poor, on bread and garlic, and even in winter there was no fire in his house. On one occasion, he paid the ransom of a soldier who had deserted and gave the tapestries of his apartments to the poor, saying, "The walls are not cold." In 1602, he was unexpectedly appointed Archbishop of Capua. 4 days after his consecration, he left Rome for his see. Although he was admirable in everything, perhaps where he distinguished himself most was in the exercise of pastoral functions in his immense diocese. Putting aside his books, this man of learning, who had no pastoral experience, dedicated himself to evangelizing his people with the zeal of a young missionary and to applying the reforms decreed by the Council of Trent. He preached continuously, visited his diocese, exhorted the clergy, instructed the children, helped the needy, and won the affection of all his children. However, he was not to remain long away from Rome. Immediately after his election, which took place 3 years later, Paul V insisted that he return to the Eternal City, and St. Robert resigned his diocese. Thereafter, as in charge of the Vatican Library and as a member of almost all the congregations, he played a very important role in all the affairs of the Holy See. When Venice arbitrarily abrogated the rights of the Church and was punished with the interdict, St. Robert was the great pontifical champion in the discussion with the famous Venetian Servite, Friar Paul Sarpi. Another even more important adversary was James I of England. Cardinal Bellarmine had reprimanded his friend, Archpriest Blackwell, for having taken the oath of fidelity to that monarch, since in it the temporal rights of the Pope were denied. King James, who regarded himself as a controversialist, intervened in the dispute with 2 books in defense of the oath, to which Cardinal Bellarmine replied. In his first reply, St. Robert employed the slightly humorous tone he handled so well and made a little fun of the monarch's bad Latin. In the second treatise, on the other hand, he responded in a serious and crushing manner to each of his adversaries' objections. Although he openly and loyally defended pontifical supremacy in the spiritual, Bellarmine's views on temporal authority did not please extremists in either camp. Because he held that the Pope's jurisdiction over kings was only indirect, he lost the favor of Sixtus V, and because he argued against the Scottish jurist Berlay that the monarchy was not an institution of divine right, his book De Potestate Papae was publicly burned in the Paris Parliament. The saint was a friend of Galileo Galilei, who dedicated one of his books to him. In 1616, he was entrusted with the mission of admonishing the great astronomer. But in his admonition, which Galileo took very well, he limited himself to begging him to simply propose as hypotheses the theories that were not yet proven. Galileo would have gained much if he had adhered to this advice. It would be impossible to mention here all of St. Robert's activities in his later years. He continued to write until the end, but no longer works of controversy. He finished a commentary on the Psalms and wrote 5 spiritual books, the last of which was entitled Art of Dying. When his life was coming to an end, St. Robert obtained permission to retire to the novitiate of St. Andrew, where he died at the age of 77 on December 17, 1621. It was precisely on that date that the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi, which had been introduced at his request, was celebrated. St. Robert Bellarmine was canonized in 1930 and declared Doctor of the Church in 1931.